Hey, Bob.
Does it look okay or is it too dark?
No, that's fine.
Okay, good.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How you doing, man?
Good, good. Long time no here.
Yeah,
See,
it's been a while.
yeah. So I gotta start off by saying, hey, Bob, what's up? Little Pillsbury Hardcore reference for three people.
Oh yeah. I still get asked that question all the time.
I bet. Well, thanks for agreeing to talk to me, and also thanks for writing the forward to Self and Punishment, Bob. Here, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Durkee is somebody I met a long time ago, like 1984, and I was first aware of you because you were putting on punk rock shows in the Los Angeles area, and I caught one of them in early 1984, and it was when you, I think it was MIA and the band Heart Attack from New York City.
That's the very first show I put on.
Oh, is it? And that was at
Yeah.
the sport. What's the name of the place? The Sportsman's.
That was at the old Sportsman's Hall in Sun Valley.
Right, and that was the very first show that you put on.
Yeah.
Did you have the name 12XU Productions already? I don't remember.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but that was just why not, you know?
Right. Yeah, I remember that. That was like one of the first shows I was able to go to. So it was really exciting. There was like 40 people there or something.
Yeah, the turnout wasn't so good. I was inspired with Bill Tuck and I interviewed Heart Attack like the week before that. They were in town. So it was kind of last minute. But
Yeah.
you know, I was tired of, you know, I used to read the letters and flip side, and people were always complaining about there weren't enough good shows.
Yes.
Which I thought, you know, looking back on it now, it seems a little silly because it seemed like from 40 years perspective, it seems like there was a lot of good shows.
There were a lot of good shows.
But you know, I mean, then I was just thinking, what the hell? Why not? How hard can it be to put on a gig?
Exactly. And what motivated you? Well, you just explained what motivated you to start doing shows, but I want to go back and ask you some questions before I actually met you, because you had been going to shows and been involved in music as a spectator, and you recorded bands for a long time. How'd you first get interested in music, and what led to discovering, for lack of better words, punk rock music? And how did all that happen? Because, like, as far as I knew, you started going to shows much earlier than I did.
Yeah, the very first like alternative, whatever you want to call it, show I went to see Oingo Boingo and the Sir Douglas Quintet at the Whiskey in February of '81.
That's funny because my uncle, the first show I was ever able to go to, my uncle took me to see Oingo Boingo. They played outside at UCLA, like in 1980. That was the first show I ever went to where I saw people play music.
Okay.
Pretty weird. Anyway, so.
But I got interested in rock music. I was probably 9 or 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, you know, rock music was everywhere, you know? So I saw some bands on TV. I think I saw some special about Creedence Clearwater of all bands on TV.
Yeah.
And I kind of was like, well, that's kind of cool, you know. I'm, you know, electric guitars and stuff.
Yeah.
And so then I just started buying records. I was already playing trumpet in school.
Mm-hmm.
So I was already interested in music. And I had probably a more unique experience in the sense that from day one, my parents just encouraged my interest in music. They didn't really care what kind of music I was listening to. They just thought it was, it was good. My mom was a music teacher. So, as I got older, I found that a lot of commercial rock music just wasn't that interesting to me.
Yeah.
I kept looking for something with more energy and more excitement. And that kind of slowly led me down the road to punk rock.
Right. And you weren't the kind of person like from talking to you online and some of your comments to me, you obviously weren't the kind of kid that, like in the mid-70s, Kiss was your gateway band and that led you down the path. You probably hated, you didn't like any of that stuff, and you were looking for something more, right? But you liked regular other kinds of rock and roll, like the Who and things like that before.
Yeah, bands like before I discovered, Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys, my favorite bands were the Beatles and the Who, and Cheap Trick.
Love Cheap Trick.
And the Rolling Stones. But yeah, in Arcadia, growing up in Arcadia, all the kids that were smoking weed and all the kids that we referred to as stoners were fans of Black Sabbath and Kiss. So that turned me off to that, because I didn't want to be them.
Right. Which I've heard before from people, for sure. Well, I did, and I wanted to be just like all those kids. That's why I gravitated toward those bands. Man, these guys are a bunch of idiots. I want to be just like them. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I have heard that before. And I had kind of a pretty rooted musical taste based out of hard rock and I guess proto heavy metal, whatever you want to call it, and of course, the Beatles or whatever, that kind of thing. So you discovered punk rock through just like buying records and like probably read some articles and probably discovered fanzines like everybody else, that kind of thing. I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, the LA Times had the calendar section, and every Sunday, and they would write all kinds of reviews about, who was playing the clubs and what was going on. So actually, in those days, just reading the LA Times every single Sunday, I started noticing that there was a lot of music going on in Southern California. Right. between the articles and then all the club ads, the Whiskey and the Roxy and the Starwood took out ads with their whole schedule, of everyone who was playing. So it's like, wow, there are all these bands I've never heard of. And so then I would just go to the record stores and start looking for the records.
Right.
And of course, a lot of those bands didn't have records out. So then it was just sort of a natural progression to start going to see them to find out what it was all about. But, also radio, K-Rock had Ronnie on the Rock on the weekends.
I was going to say, like Ronnie Bingenheimer and Ronnie on the Rock was like, not just us, but like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people in our age bracket grew up being exposed to a lot of that stuff by discovering his show on K-Rock. And did you ever listen to things like the Dr. Demento radio show before you discovered Ronnie Bingenheimer?
Oh, sure.
That was, okay. Well, that sort of was my background too, which is really funny because like I've talked to a lot of people that was exactly the progression. It was like, liking rock music and then hearing, like Dr. Demento and all that kind of stuff that he would play, just weird, funny comedy, novelty music. But then not really graduating, but then discovering Ronnie Bingenheimer. It seemed like it was rock music, Dr. Demento, and then discovering Ronnie Bingenheimer. And I don't know why, that just seems to be like the progression for a lot of people.
Well, if I remember correctly, Dr. Demento's show was on right before Rodney's on Sundays.
It was. And he would also play things like I first heard the Ramones from Dr. Demento. And of course, he played it like it was funny because it was funny, you know,
Well,
teenage Lil and
he
stuff like
made
that.
fun of the punk bands when they first came out.
Right, but he also was entertained. You know, he wasn't like condemning them. He just said, this is stupid and funny, and it's like,
Yep.
yeah, it's funny, but it's also really, it's kind of cool, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you started going to shows after, yeah, you said 81.
Yep.
And you saw a lot of bands I'm sure I would have liked to have seen, but I had to wait a couple of years, whatever. And you were just kind of like this regular looking guy going to shows. You were purely in it for the music and the excitement of that, and you weren't necessarily, you never looked like a, you know, a punk rocker or anything like that. Did you get a lot of blowback from people because you just looked like a regular guy? Was it weird? Was it weird trying to fit in with all that? And that's also like the birth of quote unquote hardcore, which is also a whole other kind of funny side issue. What was it like going to shows in Los Angeles in '82? Was it exciting and stuff? Did you fit in? Did you not fit in? What were your feelings about being exposed to all this stuff in that culture?
I didn't really worry about fitting in too much because I was going to just so many different kinds of shows. I mean, one weekend I would go see like the Minutemen and 100 Flowers at the Anti-Club. And the next weekend I'd go to Godzilla's in the Valley and see a bunch of hardcore bands.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to look like all the hardcore kids. You know, I wanted to be my own thing. So I used to wear, I used to go to thrift stores and get old suit jackets and wear a suit jacket. And then I just get some weird shirt to wear underneath it, like a weird psychedelic shirt or something.
Right.
And I don't really recall, you know, I would let my hair grow long and then I would cut it short and then I would let it go long again. And I just kind of,
same here.
yeah, I just kind of didn't care, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, what's really funny about all that too also is there's been a lot of people that have put out books about going to shows that were quote unquote punk rock shows, and they always seem to romanticize the dark side of it, or this us versus them sort of thing, and that they'd be going out to shows and there'd be punk rock gangs and this and that and violence. And it's like, maybe I was like really lucky, but I just went for the music and I never had any problems with anybody. I wasn't looking for any of that stuff also. And I find that a lot of those kind of books where they sensationalize all that stuff. I mean, you know, granted, I'm only talking about my experience, but I never saw, you know, I wasn't there to look for that, you know, so I never had any problems with anybody, no matter how I looked like or what was going on. I just always managed to avoid it. So I find some of those things kind of played up a little bit. I mean, I don't doubt that it happened, but I just wasn't there for any other reason than just I like the music, you know.
Well, I mean, I had a few run-ins with people trying to cause trouble, but I basically I just did my best to ignore it. Like I went to the Broadway Theater in Santa Ana on New Year's Eve, 1981. And because my friend's band had finally gotten a real gig, they were opening that night.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty big show. I was looking forward to it because it was going to be the first time I'd ever seen TSOL. And I think Social Distortion was on the bill and a couple other bands. And we got there and the gig just was a mess. And a riot broke out. So none of the headliners got to play. But as I was leaving, I was walking down the street to my car and some kid came up behind me and just hit me on the back of the head as hard as he could. And just unprovoked, just hit me.
Yeah.
So I looked around and I just kept going. I didn't hit him back. I didn't respond. I was like, whatever, you know. I just wanted to leave.
Right, right.
But I mean, the situations like that were pretty few and far between. I mean, I see other fights happening from time to time and stuff going on, and I just thought it was the whole self-destruct aspect of punk rock in those days. I just found so it just really bothered me. I didn't quite understand, especially when I started putting on shows, and people would trash the bathrooms and stuff, and it was just, if you guys keep doing this, they're not going to rent this place to me anymore. I won't be able to do shows. So what's the point?
I never understood that. It's like, somebody worked hard to get to get the show to happen, and here comes somebody that's just gonna, like, because it's punk rock, man, or whatever. I never understood that. I was always attracted just to the music and the creativity involved. I mean, I didn't really care about. I understand that some people like to dress up and that fashion was important to some people, or that it went along with it. But I was only there because it was like, I liked the music, and it was like a bunch of weirdos, and it was fun. But it wasn't because of having an 8-foot mohawk or anything like that. I never cared about that. And some people did, but yeah, I'm sure it wasn't a lot of fun cleaning up the bathroom after a Sportsman's Lodge show somewhere where somebody's that's mad, that stuff. How many shows did you end up putting on as far as the 1-2XU sort of thing goes?
Well, I think I rented the Sportsman's Hall maybe 6 or 7 times.
Right. And I went to most of those, I think. And you even let Scared Straight play one of them, which
Yeah.
you threw us a phone, which was really nice. So thanks. Thanks from 40 years in the future.
I always tried to put you're welcome. And I always tried to put at least 1 or 2 local bands on every single one of my shows. Always.
Yeah.
And I tried to rotate them. The ones I had seen or I'd heard of that I thought were pretty good, I always favor giving them opportunities.
Right. Well, thanks for that.
Sure. Yeah, and like just real briefly, like you mentioned, people didn't understand, when the gig was over, I was there at the venue all night cleaning the place.
Yeah.
Because that was the only way I was going to get my security deposit back.
Sure.
I mean, the guy who owned the guy who he wasn't the owner, but the guy who managed the building, he didn't want any scuff marks on the floor.
Yeah.
So after the gig, there was thousands of scuff marks from all the people slamming. I actually rented a floor buffer and buffed the whole damn floor before I went home the next morning.
Did you have anybody that helped you when you had to deal with all this stuff?
The first couple of gigs, some of Bill Tuck and his friends stuck around to help out, but after a while, nobody. It wasn't fun cleaning the place. Nobody wanted to do it.
Oh, it's definitely not fun.
So I was there. I was by myself, 4 a.m, just finishing up.
Yeah. I think a lot of people that might have heard your name, they also don't realize that you were sort of like a pretty pivotal behind the scenes kind of person for at least me and my friends back then. And you not only put on shows, but I think you had a radio show, and maybe that led to you having your own record label for a while, Fartblossom Records. So you've been sort of a contributor to things for a long time, but more of a behind the scenes guy, even though you had your own bands off and on. What was the motivation for just doing all that stuff? You just wanted to do it?
Well, yeah. How the label got started was through, I started taping all the shows I was going to in the early 80s.
Yeah. So
I started sneaking a tape recorder in to just about every gig I went to, beginning in January of 82. And then, so Fartblossom kind of started just sort of semi by accident. I made a recording of the Bad Brains the very first time I saw them, and it turned out pretty good. And I was listening to it with a couple friends of mine, and I was like, well, this sounds actually pretty good. I wonder if, I could sell these. And my friend was like, well, you should probably just give a copy to the guys at Poobah's and see if they're interested. So that's what I did. I made a copy and I gave it to one of the guys at Poobah's, and I just said, listen to it and let me know what you think, and if you'd be interested in selling a few. I wouldn't charge a lot. And the guys at Poobah's knew me because I used to go there like every week to buy records. So they just knew me as, well, there's that kid and he buys a lot of punk rock stuff,
Yeah.
So I came back a couple weeks later and I was surprised when the guy said, yeah, we could sell these. Yeah, you want to like make 4 or 5 copies and bring them in and we'll buy them from you. So that's how Fartblossom started, as a bootleg tape label.
So you had to buy one of those double cassette decks that everybody had. They were like a big letter writer.
Well, that came at first. I just borrowed my friend's tape deck and hooked them together.
Yeah.
And made copies that way. But once I got started, then Poobah started asking for other shows I had recorded. I gave him a small list of shows I'd recorded. So I was making copies of, the Bad Brains and Talking Heads and whatever shows I was going to. The only rule selling to Poobah's was, please don't bring us any tapes of local bands. Because the people in all the local bands shop there. So it's like, it wouldn't be cool to be selling tapes of bands, where the people know us. And I was like, oh, that's fine. No problem. We'll, anything from outside of LA, we'll just, anything, and just let me know what you want and what you don't want.
Right.
So after 5 or 6 months, I finally, I took some money, I saved some money, and I went out and got a double cassette deck.
Right. Oh, the double cassette deck. That was the center of my existence for a good couple of years. When you get some great mangled demo in the mail that was something that you wanted to hear, and then you had to like dub copies for the 3 or 4 or 5 people that wanted to hear it. That was very exciting. It's like, oh my God, this is great.
Oh, I as soon as I started recording shows, I immediately started looking for people to trade tapes with. And in those days, there were people would take out little classified ads in the back of all the fanzines.
Yeah.
So I started trading tapes with people. The first 2 people I started with were in New York, and then it just kind of grew from there. When I finally burned out, I had a list of pen pals, must have been at least 30 people all over the world.
Yeah.
And it just got to be too much. I was between doing the label, running the label, and putting on shows and working full time. I just didn't have time to dub tapes anymore.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I definitely want to ask you about some of the Fartblossom releases, but when was your initial first burnout phase? Like I moved away from Southern California in 1986, and I think later that year or next year, that was my burnout phase. I wasn't doing any punk rock cartoons about uniting the scene, and I didn't find any of the newer bands that were rooted in, say, like a 1982, 83 hardcore template, whatever you want to call it. I just didn't find it very exciting, and there was too much other stuff coming out that was, I've always said this, there was too much other stuff coming out that was really exciting that maybe didn't really have anything to do with what was going on 3 or 4 years ago. Certainly discovering, like a band like Honor Roll, for me, just totally paved the way into the future. And that was, one of a pretty big amount of bands that were kind of doing exciting stuff that maybe in the past they were formerly a hardcore kind of band in that culture, but then they just went far beyond that. So I'd say my burnout phase was 1986, 87. What was your burnout phase, or your first one, out of punk rock hardcore?
Well, I started working at Toxic Shock in '83,
Yeah.
and I worked 3 straight years there till '86. But I didn't, I just sort of gradually transitioned out of I lost interest in hardcore, but because I was working at the record store, there was no shortage of interesting music coming into the door all the time.
Right.
So even though, when, and not to disparage anyone, but by the time Uniform Choice came along with their Minor Threat
Mania,
with their Minor Threat, fourth generation or whatever, I just was at a point where hardcore wasn't that interesting to me, but there was so much else going on that it was all for me. There was no real burnout. I just kept progressing the whole time.
Yeah.
So, maybe, probably about the same time, I visited you in North Carolina in the summer of '86.
Yes.
I was pretty burned out on hardcore.
Sure.
But I was so busy doing everything else, I didn't really think of it that way. I just kept going. And, Pillsbury Hardcore, I left Pillsbury Hardcore a year later at the end of '87. And then I spent the next 2 years trying to get my next band together.
Right.
So everything just kept going for me. It just, between the label, trying to get a band together, and then my next progression in 1989 was to start thinking about maybe building a recording studio.
Mm-hmm.
So the label kind of fell apart in '88 when three of my distributors all went out of business the same year, owing me money.
Yeah.
So that kind of killed the label. But instead, I'd already been playing, I progressed from just making recordings of shows to working at the radio station. Mm-hmm. And I started having bands on the radio, and I was teaching myself how to engineer by having bands play live on the radio. So that all just naturally progressed. And by early '92, I had opened my own studio.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And interesting that you mentioned Honor Roll, because they were the first band that played on my radio show.
Okay. I think I knew that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was in early '87 when they came out here on tour.
Right. Got it. So, well, I was kind of curious to ask you about some of the Fartblossom records, because how did you end up? How did you actually end up starting a record label? Like, and what was the first actual? I don't know if yet. I feel like you just put out 12 inches.
No,
am I wrong? You have singles too?
Yeah, I put out singles, 12 inches. Fartblossom started, as a bootleg tape label, but then the first official legit release was the Empty Skulls compilation cassette.
Oh, okay, that's right. With the pus head cover?
Yeah. And I did that. I met some guy through Flipside who was advertising to put out a compilation in the back in the classifieds. And I got in touch with him. And he was even younger than me. He was this high school kid. And I was like, well, you've got all these great bands lined up to be on this tape, but how are you going to, do you even know what you're doing? How are you going to release it? How are you going to make copies? And he was like, well, we hadn't gotten that far. I'm like, well, I can help you do all that stuff. I was already working at the record store. So, and by then I had my double cassette deck. So I was like, well, why don't you just come over to my house and we'll edit the tape together and then give me all the material that all the bands sent you, and we'll put the booklet together, and take it to the copy place and get copies made, and it'll be done. It'll be out. So that became the first Fartblossom release, and then from there, it was right around the same time. Bill Tuck asked me to join Pillsbury Hardcore, which had just started. They'd only played a couple parties, and Bill was trying to play guitar and sing at the same time, and he decided he couldn't do that.
Right.
So he asked me if I wanted to play guitar. And so that became the second Fartblossom release, was the first Pillsbury demo tape.
Okay.
And then the third Fartblossom release was a compilation of local Pomona bands called I Love Pomona.
I Love Pomona.
And by then because I worked at the record store, the kids who were Justice League were coming into the record store all the time.
Right.
And so I got to know all the Justice League guys.
Like Ryan and
Skip and John Roa.
Ted.
And Ted. Yeah, Ted was the original guitar player.
Right.
So after they'd been together for roughly a year, and they were getting better, and I saw them all the time. Pillsbury used to play with them at parties all the time.
Yeah.
So finally, I said to them, well, if you guys want to make a record, if you guys pay for the recording, I'll put it out.
Oh, okay, that's right. So Fartblossom did release the what's it called? Think or Sank or something like that?
That was
right.
That was the first actual record on Fartblossom, was the first Justice League single.
Right. Okay. All right.
So I put that out. And it did pretty well. I think we sold around 2,000 of them.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, in those days, you could put out a 7-inch, and it wasn't too hard to sell a couple thousand. If it looked punk rock and it sounded like punk rock.
Yeah. It was definitely exciting. In the community, there was definitely a built-in audience of when you're young and not jaded yet, and you're just excited about just seeing bands play, and everyone's a pretty nice guy, it was pretty exciting. Like Scared Straight toured. I mean, obviously we didn't have a super awesome experience with Mystic Records, but that one we knew we weren't going to get paid or anything. It didn't matter. It was like, wow, somebody wants to sell a record, and we had a record, and we'd play, and people knew the songs, and there was a built-in audience, and we ended up going on tour, and people all over the country knew who we were, even though it was Mystic 7-inch. It didn't matter. There was like people read Flipside, Maximum Rock and Roll, that kind of thing. It was kind of exciting. When did your relationship? You had sort of a friendship. Well, you definitely had a friendship, but also a little bit of a business relationship with the late Reed Mullin.
Yeah.
And I know that you two worked together on more than one or two Fartblossom releases. How did you first meet Reed, and how did you decide to put out some of these recordings based on his either influence or him turning you on to that stuff?
It goes far deeper than that.
Okay.
I met Reed in the summer of '84, the first time COC came to LA.
Yeah.
So I went and saw them at the first show they played at the Café de Grand, and was just completely floored. There weren't a ton of people there, but like all the Flipside and Ink Disease folks were there, and I was friends with all those people.
Yeah.
And at the time, Bill Tuck and I sort of had a little fanzine. It started out as the Toxic Shock fanzine. It was called Brainstorm.
Right.
But the owner of Toxic Shock burned out after doing just one issue. So Bill Tuck said to me, well, why don't we just keep it going? Let's just change the name and just keep it going. So we changed the name to 12XU, and we only did 2 more issues. But while I was, the reason I bring all this up, while I was there to see COC that night, we decided to interview them for the next issue. So that's kind of how we all met.
Yeah.
You know, Bill Tuck and I, you know, we went in the back of the Cafe de Grand and sat down with Mike Dean and Reed and Woody and did an interview. So after the show and after the interview, you know, it's like I was talking to Reed. It's like, well, where else are you guys playing? I want to see you guys again if you're still going to be around here for a little while. And I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I ended up helping them get a gig at Roxanne's in Arcadia.
Yeah.
Like the next week, because they were just going up and down the West Coast. So I saw them a second time, and that just kind of snowballed from there. We started talking, and when Reed got home to North Carolina after the tour, you remember he would just call people. If he knew your number, and because I worked at the record store, it wasn't a big deal for me to, you know, to talk to Reed on the phone, because, you know, Reed was in a band and he had a label and we were selling their records.
Yeah.
So, you know, I could, you know, he would call me sometimes every day, you know, because he was just bored sitting in his parents' office.
Bob Mullin.
Yep. So we just, you know, over the next year, we became, you know, pretty good friends. And, you know, and he would ask, you know, because I was working in a record store and we were also a distributor, he would ask questions like, what do you think of this label? Or what do you think of these people? Or, you know, what's your impression? You know, because by then they were getting interest from some labels and he was wondering, you know, what they should do, you know. So we talked all the time. And that's kind of where Reed became my business partner. Because I guess over the next year he got the impression of me that I was, you know, somebody he could trust, you know, somebody who wasn't going to fuck him over. So in the summer of '85, he called me one day and he said, I'm coming out to LA and I want to talk to you. And the band's not on tour. I'm just coming by myself. And I have a proposal that I want to talk to you about. And I'm like, okay, sure. Why not? So I drove out from Pomona and picked him up at the airport out at LAX. And he spent the whole weekend with me just talking about business stuff. And he said, you know, I've got my own label, No Core. And I've got 2 Raleigh bands that I want to put out their records, but COC is taking up more and more of my time. And I don't think I have the time to devote to these projects and actually make them work. You know, I want to make sure that when these records get put out, that, you know, they get properly distributed and they get, you know, you give them to, you know, they get to the right fanzines and radio stations. And, you know, I want to make sure that they have a shot to be successful.
Yeah.
And so he said, so if I gave you some money, would you just take over? The records are done. All you got to do is put them out. And I said, really? That would be great. You know, I would love to help you out. You know, so we just kind of put together a deal, and he became, you know, the silent partner in Fartblossom. Right. So he gave me.
What were the 2 records? I think I know, but just.
It was the A Number of Things album and the Subculture album.
Right.
So he gave me $4,000 up front to press those 2 albums. And I told him, I said, well, that's probably more than I need. So I'm going to take a little bit of that money and put out, because Pillsbury Hardcore had already recorded their first 7-inch.
In a straight edge limbo, perhaps?
Yes. So I said, well, that's also going to get released at the same time.
Okay.
He said, and he's like, that's cool. I'm cool with that. So that's what I did. So he sent me the master tapes for those 2 records and all the artwork. You did the cover for the Number of Things album.
I sure did. Yeah. I did that. I did that while visiting Raleigh for the first time in the summer of '85, before I actually committed to moving out next year. Anyway, right. I did the cover for that. Simon Bob Sinister drew the Subculture
Yep.
Dream album cover. I'm not really a huge fan of the Number of Things record, but I still love the Subculture record.
Oh, the Subculture record for a bunch of high school kids was a really, really good record.
Really good record. Like,
yeah, I was
naughty teenage.
I was very excited. I was actually very excited to have that on Fartblossom.
Oh yeah, it's a great record. It's still a good record.
Oh yeah. So by October or November of '85, all those records got released.
Right.
And it just kind of went from there. Now with those 3 releases, Fartblossom became like a real label.
Right.
Not saying the Justice League record wasn't real, but now there was an actual label with more than 1 record on it.
Right. Well, let me ask you about the Justice League album, the Shattered Dreams album, because I like Justice League and we were friends, and I always kind of equated them as being like, well, this is a band that's kind of sort of similar to Scared Straight or a number of bands like that, where well-meaning, competent, maybe nothing super special, but fun, whatever. And then the Justice League album came out with a singer that was only in the band for the time that record was recorded, and he was already gone. And I remember like that record, I never saw a copy, but I remember Reed actually, I think he had it. And it was right after I moved there. And I remember being impressed because they kind of matured,
Considerably.
And it was like the songs were, I think they had gotten Mark Maxey in the band, whatever. Yeah. And I remember it was like a nice little gem of an album that just kind of, you didn't, maybe because of the singer situation, but do you have any memories of that record or thoughts about the band during that time?
Oh yeah, I had been following them the whole time. I mean, technically I was their manager for a while.
Yeah. So
they used to rehearse in the same place Pillsbury rehearsed. So
yeah.
I would drop in from time to time to listen to their songs. And like you said, when they got Maxey as their new bass player, and Casey joined the band as the singer, which was very, very short, but still he was a pretty good front man. I'm probably one of the few people that actually saw him sing for the band because he only did 1 or 2 shows.
Long Beach.
But anyway, that's right, because you guys played with him that time.
Scared Straight played a show and Scott Radinsky was playing baseball, so they asked me to sing.
Yeah.
If you want to call it that. Right. And I remember that Justice League show. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. So I had noticed that their songwriting had improved immensely.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, the single, the 45 didn't make a lot of money. I think I ended up with, I think I owed them like $200 or $300 in their cut of the profits.
Right.
So I made a deal with them to do the album. I said, I'll give you, your cut to get started on the recording, but you'll have to pay for the rest of the recording. And I suggested they go to Radio Tokyo out in Venice because Ethan James had done a couple albums for the Minutemen and they all sounded really good.
Yeah.
And I figured, I called Radio Tokyo and got Ethan on the phone, and he seemed like a really good guy. Like he wouldn't be scared of a bunch of kids playing punk rock. So not me. I mean, he'd already done the Minutemen, so you know. Anyway, so I booked this. I booked a session for Justice League to go make their album at Radio Tokyo, and I actually went down there the first day and watched them set up and everything, and gave Ethan, you know, the $300 to get started or whatever.
Yeah.
And that very first day, as they started playing the basic tracks for the songs, it just sounded so good. I was like, wow, you guys have gotten like really good in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
So, and that's just, you know, that's, it all came together. They finished the recording, and we argued a little bit over the cover. I wasn't real happy with how the cover turned out, but that's what they wanted. That's what they wanted.
Whose idea? Oh, it was the band.
Yeah, that was Ryan found some picture in some psychology textbook, and he's like, I want this on the cover. I'm like, okay. I don't think it really, it's very descriptive of what the band is, but if that's what you want, okay.
Yeah. So
that's what we did. You know, even with Reed's help, though, money was always a problem, because it took the distributors so long to pay me for the last record.
Yeah.
I was always fighting with, you know, with the people at Dutch East and Important and all those distributors, trying to get money out of them so I could pay the pressing plant and get the next record made. So, but you know, it all worked out in the long run. The Justice League record came out. They went on tour in the summer of '86, and the record was a little late. It didn't come out till later that year.
Mm-hmm.
But it did finally come out. And once again, you know, we sold a few thousand copies of it. So, you know, but of all the bands I put out on Fartblossom, the biggest problem with having any kind of momentum was none of the bands toured except for Justice League.
Yeah.
Subculture tried to tour, and it fell apart after like 2 or 3 shows. Their guitar player did, you know, they rented a motel room, and their guitar player did something stupid, and the police got called, and I don't remember if anybody went to jail for the night or anything, but their parents got involved and the tour was canceled.
Right.
And a number of things weren't even together really much after the first album.
No.
And Pillsbury tried to tour. We actually did tour. We went on a really short 2-week tour of the US in the summer of '87. But that was, by the end of the tour, we were fighting, and it didn't last much longer after. I mean, they kept going. They figured I was the problem, so they just asked me to leave. So, and they kept going without me.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the other bands, all the records I ever put out, you know, nobody toured, nobody. So it was just really hard to keep the label going.
Yeah, you were just kind of documenting the moment, like pretty much is what everybody does when they just, well, let's want to put out a record. And then worrying about the business aspect of it a little bit afterwards, and had to make stuff successful. And then you figure, oh yeah, well, bands have to go and promote themselves and go on tour, and if they're not wanting to do that, then it's like a labor of love and nothing else, not much of the future. So,
Very true.
Yeah. Did you have, for a while there, I thought that did you have anything at all to do with the Honor Roll album, the Pretty Song coming out? Because I feel like you did. I'm not sure though. Like that was a no-core Reed's label, Eskimo. I guess somebody on like Bob, maybe Bob Schick, I don't know. Did you have anything to do with that record coming together? Because I feel like you did, but I'm not really sure.
Well, I was supposed to put it out.
Okay.
And that was part of the reason I went to Raleigh in the summer of '86 and ended up staying with you.
Yeah.
Was Reed got it in his head that I was a hardcore kid, and he was convinced that I wouldn't understand Honor Roll.
Right.
It's like you really need to see these guys because they don't sound like anyone else. And I'm like, well, Reed, I love the Minutemen. I love all this other kind of music. I don't think I'm going to have a problem understanding or appreciating Honor Roll. So Reed sent me one of their demos, and it was different, but it took me a few listens, but I started to really like it. So I came out to Raleigh that summer because the Honor Roll guys were coming down from Richmond to make the record in a small. Well, actually, they were making the record in a small studio in Richmond.
Yeah.
So I went and visited Penn, met Penn for the first time, and hung out with him at the studio where they were working on the Pretty song.
Right.
And at that moment, the Honor Roll record was going to be a Fartblossom record. It was the next no-core project that Reed wanted to give me. And so I'd already been taking out ads for the album in fanzines as one of the coming Fartblossom releases. And at the last minute, for whatever reason, Penn called me and it said, I don't want our album on Fartblossom. I just want to do it myself. And I was really, really, really disappointed. Because I've been hearing the record and I'm like, wow, this is going to be a really good record. And I was all geared up. I was ready to promote.
It's a great record. Those are songs. The only thing that's kind of lacking is the guitar is kind of quiet. But other than that, flawless album.
Yeah, I think Penn, for all of his talent, I think Penn was really insecure about his guitar playing.
Mm-hmm.
And because I noticed that too. When I was there at the studio while they were mixing one of the songs. And I was like, Penn, you got to turn the guitar up.
Right.
It even just a little bit.
Yeah.
It's such, I mean, your guitar playing is so good,
Yeah.
So, but he was layering all these keyboards onto the record, just way low in the background.
I didn't know.
I sat there as they were working on that song Present Conditions, and he was putting a keyboard into the song. And I was like, that's cool if that's what you want to do, but you still have to turn the guitar up. And he wouldn't listen to me. So
that's interesting.
So
well how did that, man, that is disappointing. I didn't know that. So in other words, you were gonna put it out at the last minute, he just changed his mind. Who put it out then? Who actually put it out?
Well, Reed paid for it.
Right. Well, I know that.
I was there in Richmond with me, Reed, and Penn, and Reed standing there and hands Penn a whole bunch of money to pay for the recording. Mm-hmm. So Reed was paying for everything. And in the end, Reed paid for it as far as I know, but Penn and Bob Schick handled the distribution and all the other stuff.
Right.
So it was a no-core Eskimo record.
Got it.
And I convinced them to sell me 50 copies because I had a bunch of people who had mail ordered it from me.
Yeah.
And I needed to fill those mail orders. So they sold me a handful of copies, but I don't know if they ever sent out promos or anything. I don't remember, but I may have given one of those 50 to like the guys at Flipside and the guys at Ink Disease, so at least got reviewed.
Yeah.
But other than that, if they weren't going to let me release the record, I couldn't justify spending any money to promote it.
Sure.
But they did tour a lot in those days. They came to LA twice, and that's how they got on the radio show with me, because they were in town and they had a free night where they weren't playing, So it's like, well, why don't you come over to the radio station and you guys can play on the air and we'll do an interview and everything.
Right.
So.
Huh. I didn't know any of that. How long were you still in touch with Reed after that stuff?
Well, Reed and I stayed in touch, but when I left the record store in '86, we didn't talk quite as much after that because I ended up getting a job where I couldn't talk to him on the phone every day.
Right.
But we stayed in touch. That week that I was in Raleigh was when Simon Bob joined COC. And they played their very first show at the brewery with Simon Bob. That was that same week. So after that, they came to LA several times and I always went to see them and I would hang out with them. But then, as time went on, COC kind of went through a hiatus. They broke up, what was it, in early '88?
Yeah, Mike quit. I was actually living with Mike at the time, and I think he kind of quit while they were on tour. And then they immediately replaced him, and then that was, I'm not going to say it was never the same, but it was never really the same. But that's not to say I haven't liked stuff along the way. And when that happened, after Reed died, I got a lot of people writing to me and getting in touch with me because of those times, and would write back to people and say, well, what people don't understand is that there were like 2 or 3 different Reeds along the way, and that was just the one Reed I knew. And then after that Reed, after that period was over, I wasn't really as friendly with him anymore, although it wasn't like a bad thing when I'd see him once in a while.
Right.
So I never really saw, I just wasn't in his back pocket the way I was for a little while. And that seems like, after he did pass, people would come out and compare those kind of stories. He was, he was a good guy. And then he just kind of went off I always thought he just kind of went off on a tangent, which is a pretty nice way of putting it.
Well, after that period where Mike quit the band, Mike actually called me and he came out to LA with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And he stayed with me because he was on his way. They were going down to El Salvador. They were going to go down to Central America.
Yeah.
So I saw Mike, and then I hadn't talked to Reed for a while. And then, I think it was 89 or 90, COC got back together and they signed with the major label.
Yeah.
And I went and saw them, I think it was in 94 when they played the Troubadour here in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got me backstage and we hung out and we had kind of a, old times kind of get together, and we all talked and everything was cool and they were all really nice. But I wasn't as excited about the Pepper band as I was about the early band.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that ended up, that time I saw them in 94, that ended up the last time I saw any of those guys.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of similar. I still see Mike pretty often. Mike's exactly the same,
He's got his own studio now, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's he has sort of a partner, or he's renting the building, or there's some weird combination. But yeah, Mike is, he did what you did and what a lot of people did. He just learned how to record music, so he spends a lot of time doing that, so yeah, well, now I'm sort of at a loss of where to go for this chat. Well, we're talking about ancient history, of course, but for me these days, I don't really get out much, and I have, a daughter, and I got married and when I have my daughter, I have her for 3 days, every 3 days. And then when I don't have her, that's when I work and do stuff. And it's not about really, I don't really go to shows anymore. I'm kind of burned. I mean, I still love music as much as I ever have and listen to music all the time, but I'm just not super excited about going to a venue for whatever reason. I don't know what it is, but I'm still involved as much as I can be, but it's really shifted to artwork for
Right.
the majority.
Well, yeah, your artwork is very impressive these days. You've gotten real. Not saying that your old stuff wasn't good, but your new stuff is great.
Well, the old stuff was very well-meaning. So after 30 or 40 years, hopefully it is going to get better. So, what's a typical day for you now that you're retired? Do you still do you go out about town, or what do you do these days?
Well, I just to give a brief recap, I ran my studio in the 90s, and then the studio business kind of started to dry up. And when that happened, I went to work for Guitar Center for a long time.
How was that?
Believe it or not, I actually really enjoyed working for Guitar Center, because when I was in the stores, as annoying as some customers could be, there were a lot of really nice customers, really cool people, and everybody was talking about music the whole time. Yeah. So, it was, we weren't really necessarily just talking about punk rock, but you would meet people that were doing all kinds of creative stuff. So it was a nice trade-off from working at the record store and everything else. And then when I made the transition from the stores to the corporate office, where I became a buyer, and I was in charge of buying all the microphones and headphones and other odds and ends for the entire chain. So that I actually really enjoyed that aspect of the job, because I sort of looked at it as, this probably sounds kind of screwed up, but I sort of looked at it as, if I could make a deal with a vendor and put a product in the stores and give the customers a really good price, in some small way, I thought I was, sort of helping musicians save money.
Yeah.
Because musicians were going to need a microphone and headphones anyways. So if I could get them a good deal, whatever, why not?
Right.
But anyway, everything changed for me, though. Things were going along just fine. And then in 2008, there was the recession. And when the recession hit, I lost my job at Guitar Center because they fired a whole bunch of people to save money.
Yeah.
And then 6 months, well, actually, it wasn't 6 months. 2 months after I left Guitar Center, I was diagnosed with kidney failure.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So ever since early 2009, it's been a struggle where I've sometimes had a job and was doing okay, and then the job would go away and I would struggle for a while.
Yeah.
And then 2 years ago, I lost my last job. And ever since then, with the pandemic and everything, all I do these days to make money is I buy and sell used records.
Right.
So that's what I do, as much as possible. And now I'm one of those guys you see at all the record swap meets. Right. I'm a middle-aged white guy selling used records.
Right.
So that's what it's become. But I enjoy it.
Yeah. You look like the kind of guy that would turn some young kid onto something really great that they've never heard of. You look just like somebody like from my youth that would go, "No, man, check this out. Oh my God, this guy knows so much about cool music."
That's it doesn't happen as often as I would like, but yeah, every once in a while, you talk to younger people, and yeah, you end up making recommendations.
Sure, it's hard hard not to.
Yeah. So, my next goal, if I can make it happen, is, there's a lot of interest in vinyl nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that I can get some money from the SBA and I can restart Fartblossom strictly as a reissue label. So, so hopefully within the next year, if all goes according to plan, I'm going to take some of those live tapes I have and turn them into records.
Yeah. Are you gonna be able to, or do you even want to reissue some of the stuff that Fartblossom originally put out, if you're allowed?
Yeah. Well, this guy at this record store down in Orange County, he already reissued the Subculture album.
Mm-hmm. I heard about it being reissued a while back.
Yeah, he got the tapes for me, and the band was all cool with it. So that already happened. So I'm not really too excited. There doesn't seem to be much interest in the Justice League stuff, and that stuff all got reissued on CD back in the 90s.
Okay.
So I do have plans to do a Pillsbury Hardcore album of all the stuff that we recorded after the 7-inch, because there's a whole bunch of songs that most people have never heard.
Wasn't there I could be imagining this, but I had this memory of driving. It was after I moved away, and I felt like I was driving around with you and maybe Reed, and there was a version of Foxy Lady that you guys recorded that you sang, and I had no idea, was that an album? Was that, I don't even remember. Was that like an album that actually came out, or was that when the band fell apart and none of that ever came out?
Well, yeah, we recorded an album, but none of it ever came out. The band fell apart, but yeah, there's a whole finished album that's never been released.
Right, and that's with Bill and
yeah, I sing like half the songs, and Bill sings like half the songs.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that'd be pretty exciting if you would, there's the one thing that's really interesting about, I've been doing these interviews with people for the last 2 years since the pandemic started, when I was working on the book that you did the forward to, and where I talked to a lot of people that I met through, I hate to say our generation or whatever, but at the same time, I can't really pretend to be a young person or apologize for being old or whatever.
Right.
I don't do that, but everybody I've talked to has said the same thing about, people's ongoing interest, not necessarily just people like us, but younger people getting into stuff that we remembered liking and seeing, in your case, eventually putting out, and just the legs that punk rock and hardcore and weird alternative music, or whatever you want to fucking call it, underground music, just the ongoing relevance of it for people. And everybody seems to think it's crazy. It's 40 years later, and here we are talking about something from 40 years ago, and just maybe because of the internet or whatever, but I always just kind of looked at it like, well, if it's good music, it's good music no matter what you want to call it or what era it comes out of. But I'm still really blown away that people are still so into that stuff, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think it's weird that we're sitting around and I'm asking you questions about Justice League from 40 years ago or whatever? Why are people still outside of us talking about it? Why do you think people are still so interested in what has happened before?
I think a lot of it is, it's not really a nostalgia thing so much as, all the stuff that we saw happening in the late 70s and early 80s, all the way up through the 80s, is sort of where all of the underground music today originally came from.
Yeah.
So, if you look a little bit at the history of rock music, you've got the initial period of the 50s with Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And then the next era is when bands like the Stones and the Beatles came along.
Right.
And then the last big revolution in rock music was punk rock. And and depending on your perspective, that started in 77 and continued for at least 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Through the best of it. And there were so many great bands, all over, whether it's the UK or Europe or the United States or even Australia, that came out of that era. And there's just so much music that people still gravitate towards finding out about stuff that, so much of the music was not commercial.
Yes.
And so if you get interested, you really start to go down a rabbit hole trying to find out about all kinds of obscure bands and artists from that era.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what, it doesn't drive everyone, but it drives enough people to want to learn more about, whatever they're interested in, to find out about a lot of this stuff,
Yes.
And that's where, you with your books and your writings come in, and, hopefully, people like me who want to try and put some of that music back out there so people can find it again. Or, there's quite a few labels that specialize in doing nothing but reissues these days.
Yeah.
So, the music just kind of, and it's a really good thing. It just lives on, and so.
Yeah. Like, I'm not really, to me, it's just all, good music is good music. And I don't really think it's nostalgic either. It's just more like more good music for me to enjoy. I'm not really nostalgic for those times. And I'm certainly not nostalgic for how I thought back then as a human being. But, the music was always the most important thing. And
well, we've all gotten older, and, you appreciate it on a different level.
Yeah.
You're not looking at it like, when I was in my 20s, everything was new. Everything I was experiencing was new to me.
Yeah.
So whether I was listening to Neil Young for the first time, or whether I was going to see a bunch of hardcore bands, it was all new to me. So it was all very exciting.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I can't look at it like you said, I can't look at it the same way, but I certainly still enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here.